Greek had a referendum asking the voters, hey, do you want to go along with what the Europeans want and do more austerity measures and get the bailout and continue to go along with those measures? Or do you vote no and say that we're not interested in that and we'd like a different path? The answer was a resounding no. 61.31% of the Greeks, with a significant voter turnout. They needed 40% voter turnout. They got over 60% voter turnout, with a huge majority, 61% saying, no, we do not want to follow the European Union rules on this. We don't think it's fair, and we're ready to deal with the consequences, and there might be consequences. The thing that I'm actually particularly angry about is why we got into this mess in the first place, and I have a take on that I want to save for a little bit. But first, let's talk about the immediate situation. Alexis Tsipras was happy. Of course, he's the prime minister who was put in place to be tough on the Europeans and to get them out of the austerity measures. He said, even in the most difficult circumstances, democracy can't be blackmailed. It is a dominant value and the way forward. And so the people of Greece celebrated. Now, you see this, well, obviously some percentage of the Greeks voted yes, and so they're not celebrating, but as you see in the pictures, there are a lot of folks who are very happy about the result, and they know that more pain might be on the way for Greece at the hand of the European powers, predominantly led by Germany, honestly, and some of the creditor nations like Netherlands and Finland. Now, which way they're going to go is a very open question. Right now, the Germans are not in a forgiving mood. Angela Merkel's government seems to have signaled from the outset that they will not bend, and that so perhaps Greece might have to leave the European Union and the euro currency, and they'd have to come back with a new Greek currency. Wow, that would be interesting. In fact, Martin Schulz, head of the European Parliament, said if they say no, they will have to introduce another currency after the referendum because the euro is not available as a means of payment. Now, whether that's justifiable, again, we'll have to take a look at in a second, but let me give you more consequences. The country has defaulted on its debts, its banks are closed, and its citizens are now facing drastic limits on their ability to withdraw money from ATMs or make foreign purchases with credit or debit cards. So this was not an easy vote. There's been a lot more pain in Greece. The people who voted no, I think, did so rather bravely. Now, the finance minister in Greece, who had a very poor relationship with the rest of the European financial folks, he resigned immediately. Yanis Varoufakis, I'm sure I pronounced that wrong, says, and I shall wear the creditors' loathing with pride. Sounds like an FDR kind of statement, right? I welcome their hatred. Okay, and then he got on his motorcycle, got his wife on the back of the motorcycle, and took off. Now, whether you agree with him or disagree with him, you got to admit, that's pretty badass. Okay, so God bless on that. Now, what are their choices going forward? Well, the Greek prime minister immediately picked up the phone to Putin and said, you Putin any money in? Okay, anyway. And then they had this conversation. The head of the VTB, Russia's second largest state bank, said over the weekend that Russia might be interested in buying Greek assets if they were to be privatized, but that direct loans to Greece were unlikely. So that doesn't sound that great. I mean, if you're going to privatize a lot of things in Greece, that's got its own host of problems. I'm not sure that's the direction I would go. I'm sure at that point, yes, some of the Russian banks would be interested, but so would a lot of the banks and different firms throughout the world. So now let's go to the people who think that the Greeks did the right thing here and that the other European powers ought to be a little bit more careful before criticizing them. One of those is Thomas Piketty, the person who famously took on income inequality and wrote a really interesting book that took off all throughout the world. He said, look, wait a minute now, look at the history of the national debt. Great Britain, Germany, and France were all once in the situation of today's Greece, and in fact had been far more indebted. The first lesson that we can take from the history of government debt is that we are not facing a brand new problem. There have been many ways to repay debts and not just one, which is what Berlin and Paris would have the Greeks believe. Now, that makes a lot of sense. That's absolutely true. The reality is that Greece is not the first country in the history of the world, let alone Europe, to have issues with debt and not be able to pay it off. In fact, let's show you a map of Europe and show you the number of bankruptcies that different countries have gone through. So you see Greece has gone through 6. Well, if they have one more in this case, congratulations, they would tie Germany, of all countries, who's now leading in bankruptcies. Now, that's since the year 1800, so of course it's been a long, long time, and obviously a lot of that happened during the wars, but it's not like it doesn't count. It does count. So as you can see there, Portugal, Spain, Austria have all had a significant number of bankruptcies in the last 200 years. This is not a new issue. And so part of the problem here is that Greece borrowed too much money. We understand that, right? And they're having trouble paying it off. They've done austerity for 5 years now, and it's not working. In fact, Paul Krugman believes that it is counterproductive. So all that pain is for nothing. Now, when you look at, though, why they're in this situation and why we have for example, the German people pitted against the Greek people, I think we really get to the core of this issue. Let me quote here Matt Iglesias from Vox. He says, with Greece facing insolvency 5 years ago, the people running Europe came up with a deeply unsatisfying solution. Rather than default on its debts to private creditors, Greece would be giving money by its European partners to pay them off. But the debt would not actually be forgiven. It would simply be transferred to the European Central Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and a passel of other European states. Whoa, think about that for a second. I'm not sure a lot of folks understand that or knew that or discuss it nearly enough. So it turns out there were private banks in Europe who made loans to Greece. Greece couldn't pay them off. Well, there's a fairly normal situation when you give out loans. You assess risk, and if you didn't do a good job of assessing risk, sometimes you lose your money. Welcome to capitalism. That's how it works, right? And you assess a certain interest rate based on the risk that you have. But right now in Europe, like we have in the US, we don't really have capitalism. What we've done is privatize the gains and socialize the losses. So 5 years ago, the European governments and the International Monetary Fund, et cetera, came in and said, hey, private banks, you're free to go. Here, we'll pay you off. And we'll take on the debt on behalf of the other citizens of Europe. Why in the world would you do that? You see, that's the underlying problem. What they did, and this is the oldest trick in the book, is get the people to fight among themselves, to make this a German versus Greek problem rather than a Greece versus dumbass creditors who lent them money they shouldn't have lent. Now, look, if you're Greece, it's a little tough to say, hey, dummy, you shouldn't have lent me money. Okay, you're in a difficult situation. I certainly wouldn't phrase it that way. But if you're an outside person looking at that situation, you can say, hey, listen, yes, it's the fault of the Greeks for not being able to pay their debt. It happens all the time. It happens with governments. It happens with corporations. Donald Trump's corporations have gone bankrupt 4 different times. It's not an unusual circumstance. But it's also the fault of the creditors who did not assess risk properly. And what happened? They got let off the hook right away. They got all the gains, and then when it came to the losses, no, you socialize those. All of a sudden, you've got socialism, and you put that onto the people of France, Germany, and other parts of Europe, and then you say to those same German people, no, the enemy isn't the guys who you just paid for no goddamn reason. The enemy are the Greeks. So you go fight them. Like here in America, this is, again, the oldest trick. What you do is you take all the money, like the bailout of the banks that we did in 2008, after they crashed the economy, after they cost us 8 million jobs, you pay them all off 100 cents on the dollar, which is unbelievable. You give them all the money, even though they're the ones who screwed it up. And then you say, no. Now, the middle class and the poor, you guys fight amongst yourselves. No, it was the teachers' union fault. It was the poor people who were borrowing too much money for their houses. It was black people. Oh, they told us to give us, told them to give us loans, and look at what happened. No. It was the private banks that screwed it up, both in America and here in Europe. But they're off scot-free. And now we're fighting amongst each other. It's gross. It's absolutely gross. So the good German people and other people in Europe who are mad at the Greeks, look, I know why. Look, in the beginning, the retirement age in Greece was 58. That's too low. Now, here in America, they're trying to raise the retirement age from 65 and from 67. I fight against that. There has to be some bounds of reason. But 58 is pretty low compared to the rest of the world. But it's not that way anymore. That was the old rule. Since 2007, they raised it to the age of 67. So now the big complaint of some of these, the European Central Bank, et cetera, is, well, there are a lot of loopholes and women don't have to go to 67. They're at 60. They should be brought from 60 to 65, and then you should close some of the loopholes. Now we're arguing over minutia. I mean, you can go either way on that, or you can go somewhere in the middle and reach a reasonable agreement instead of pitting them against one another. So yes, a big percentage of the domestic gross product of Greece goes to their pensions. I understand that. They've got to cut that down. They understand that. The question is, what is the reasonable middle ground? Not, no, that's it, no more pensions for you guys, and austerity, austerity, austerity. In fact, let me go to Paul Krugman now. He says, austerity probably shrinks the economy faster than it reduces debt, so that all that suffering serves no purpose. Do you understand that? You see, if you don't have austerity measures, Krugman and other economists argue your economy would grow faster, which would actually bring in more revenue to the government and help pay the creditors back quicker. But you do the austerity, you destroy the economy, and they have over 25% unemployment in Greece, then the government doesn't have any revenue, and the situation gets worse. Why did you go through all that pain? It was counterproductive. Krugman finally says, if they can't make a go of Europe's common currency, it's because that common currency offers no respite for countries in trouble. And so he says, look, you know what? Also, part of the problem is the euro. If the euro cannot withstand any government having issue with its debt, which invariably will happen, if it wasn't going to be Greece at this time, it was going to be another country at another time. Perhaps the Germans, who have gone through a lot of problems with debt in their past, right? And so if your euro cannot handle any kind of bump in the road like that, maybe the problem isn't Greece, the problem is the euro, because you've built an inflexible system. So it's not to say the Greeks didn't borrow too much money. It's not to say that they didn't have some hand in this problem. Of course they did. But if you think it's only the Greeks' fault and that the answer is to crush the Greek people more, which is of course what we hear from the powers that be in the establishment, well, that's wrong. That's not true. And oftentimes it is counterproductive. What we need instead is a reasonable compromise, which is what usually happens when people cannot pay their debts. You say, I will pay you back this much through this process, and then we'll call it even. Trump has done it 4 times. Companies in this country have done it over and over again. And by the way, whenever they go bankrupt, the big banks love to do this. But when it comes to the Greek people, all of a sudden, no, it's not allowed. We need to crush them further, and they need to bend to our will. Well, guess what? They voted no, and they are not going to bend to your will. So now you've all got a problem. Okay, come back to the table, come up with a reasonable solution. Otherwise, no one wins.